Ah, okay. This is common mistakes I see in webcomics and digital art, specifically referring to line work. So as you can see, this is my original sketch. I prefer to sketch in a color either red or purple. And you can see that there's a lot of sketchy lines going along a lot of different things that are not pristine and not perfect. So what I do is I have an auto action recorded in Clip Studio Paint that's going to turn this layer to the blue draft layer, and it's also going to change the opacity to be lighter. And that brings that layer down to 43% and changes it to a light blue color, which is easier for me to see. One of the mistakes I see quite often is that young artists will try to use really thin line work on their piece to try to look more professional or make the line work seem to disappear. However, you're going to run into a few problems if you go with line work that is too thin. One of those being that it's going to be harder to hide where your lines connect. It's also going to be harder to hide if you are sketchy in any way, that those lines are going to show much more of that sketchiness and indecision. The next problem we're going to have is that when we zoom out, it becomes much harder to read compared to a thicker line. We also see that if we go with a size that is very small, especially if it's very small in relation to what the brush can do, we're not going to see a lot of variation in line width within our strokes. One of the beautiful things about having an iPad with an Apple Pencil or having a drawing tablet like a Wacom or a Huion is that you can see a variation in line width. So if we go back and we draw in, for example, his eyebrows, we can get that nice taper at the end of a line. We can also choose to go in with a line using the same brush and get a much thinner line for details that are less important, and a thicker line for details which we want to stand out. If you decide to vary the line width, but not within an individual stroke, for example, you want to do a heavier line in some places and a lighter line in another, but you don't want pressure sensitivity attached to it, then larger shapes, such as Drexel's hair, his eyebrows, his nose, his overall face shape, you will do in the larger size. You may decide to do the overall outline in a slightly thicker line weight. And then smaller details, for example, going around his eye, you may choose to go with a thinner brush. Another thing that is incredibly helpful is the pen settings. If you choose to go with Clip Studio Paint, one option is the stabilization, which smooths out any bumps or lumps in your lines. So if you draw a wibbly line, stabilization will correct it. If you take the stabilization all the way down, you can see every movement of the pen. And there are some times where you want a lot of movement, but not always. If you want those long, beautiful, clean strokes, you're going to want to increase your stabilization. Another setting in Clip Studio Paint that is helpful is the vector magnet, which you can also increase or decrease. What the vector magnet does is when you get close to a line, it assumes that you want those lines to connect, and it will fill in the slight gap if there's a pressure difference. It's one of those things that's very small and minor that you may not notice, and it'll be personal preference if you want to use it or not. It also helps if you're going to fill in color to have the vector magnet so that you can close all of your lines and you don't accidentally fill in the entire area beyond your character. And also within Clip Studio Paint, there's another tool that is quite useful, and that is to make your line art a vector layer. That'll be over in the layer settings where you have create a new layer, and the next to it is create a new vector layer. Vector compared to raster means that it's made out of points rather than pixels. And by doing that, it then allows you to be able to control your lines after you have created them. I have the shortcut O to do my object selection. If I select a line, I can then move the line. I can select the box and move it as is. I can select one of the corner points and change the overall flow of the line. And I can select the individual points and change those within a line. And perhaps one of the most useful features is to use the vector eraser, which will be under eraser. I put it as its own entity and I created the shortcut of V so that I can go right to it. What the vector eraser does is when it sees two lines come to a point, any line beyond that, it will erase in a single stroke, which means I keep my vector eraser at 2 pixels, which is fairly small, but anytime I hit something, it'll erase anything beyond that line. So when you're doing line art and you want to pull this line all the way down, you can do so, and where it connects, you can take it and clean it up. It also helps for things, for example, his chin, I can draw the line beyond where his goatee goes. I can draw his goatee and then remove that line. Or for example, if I'm doing his hair goes behind his shoulder, so I can remove that line as well. In addition to being able to use the vector eraser in Clip Studio Paint, there's an option down at the bottom, which will allow you to adjust line width. You may either thicken to create a more bold line, you may select narrow to create a thinner line, and you can also change how thick or how narrow each stroke will make the line. For example, if I move this up, it's going to change 3.5 pixels worth and become much thinner, much faster. There's also an option to redraw if you feel some of the line is not how you intended it to be, but you don't want to erase the entire line. You also have the option to simplify the vector line so that when you go into Object and select it, there are fewer points to move around. So what does this look like in practice? So this is an example of what I would do for line work. You'll notice that there is variation in the width of the line work. For example, I generally do eyelashes being thicker to show a thicker upper lash. I increase the size to do the pupils. And then I'll use smaller lines for the lower lash line, things like showing Drexel is tired, and sometimes smaller things like his teeth or details in his goatee. So what have we learned today? Number 1 is to not go too thin with our line work. Doing this can exaggerate problems like being sketchy and may not read well from a distance. Number 2, we want to vary the line width, in part because we want to direct the eye what to look for, and also it makes a more professional, more polished looking finished piece. Number 3, when doing line work, long single strokes over small sketchy ones will get you better results. And of course that's made easier by number 4, where we utilize stabilization and vector layers. Hey, hi! Support me on Patreon, where I create art tutorials and do art critiques. And you can read my webcomic, Fortune's Fancy, available on Webtoons, Comic Fury, Tapas, and fortunesfancy.com. For anything else, check out my link tree. Thanks, bye!